Religion, and Ecology. Ellen is an eco-theologian, a spiritual leader, a writer, and a creative. She founded Shomrei Adamah, Keepers of the Earth, the first national Jewish environmental organization in 1988. She's written several books, including Let the Earth Teach You Torah, Ecology and the Jewish Spirit, and The Splendor of Creation. She also created the first ecologically centered Tu B'Shvat, which is the Jewish New Year of the Trees, Seder in 1998, and has done amazing work popularizing Tu B'Shvat as a community-wide interspiritual ecological art celebration for all. Ellen's most recent book, which I can't talk about enough, is her Haggadah, The Promise of the Land. It's the first comprehensive ecological Haggadah, which is the guidebook for Passover. Even in the midst of the pandemic, Ellen was busy organizing Earth Seders, doing enormous Zooms for Passover. Ellen continues to write and teach on the ecology of the Hebrew Bible and serves on the advisory board of the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology. And she's also on the steering committee of the Third Act Faith and the advisory board of the Green Sabbath Project. So Ellen, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today.
It's my pleasure to be here and to virtually be in Montana. I'm like fantasizing what it would be like to be there with you all. And thank you so much, Rebecca, for all the work that you're doing around trying to save the synagogue and inviting me to be your first speaker. I'm really honored.
Well, thank you. So one of the things that I learned as I started reading about you was your interesting journey into this field of eco-theology. And I was wondering if you could share with us, what started you on this journey to studying and looking for ecology, the connection of ecology, environmentalism, and Judaism?
Sure. Well, I was really oriented towards the outdoors as a child. I grew up in New England, in Massachusetts, in a small town. And I spent a lot of time outdoors. And even as a young kid, when we would drive up to the mountains, I was sort of horrified to see billboards in the, sort of peppering the forests. And it was very disturbing to me. And I was basically just disturbed at sort of materialism gone amok from the time I was pretty young. And when I was in high school, I had the opportunity to study world religions. And so I was born Jewish, but I didn't really have much of a Jewish background at all in terms of a Jewish education. And my family celebrated Rosh Hashanah, and that was about it. Yom Kippur, Passover. So I started getting interested in religion when I had to study it in high school. And I realized that the religions in general were answering a lot of the questions that I had as a young searching adolescent about how to live a life and what matters and value, it was the religions of the world that were talking about values. And I also started studying, I was at a school where I got to study environmental studies. It was very early, but I had a teacher who was teaching environmental studies. And I took this class. I was really impressed by it. And I ended up going to UC Berkeley in one of the first environmental studies programs in the country. So I had all of that kind of background. And then I led wilderness river trips for a few years and just did a lot of backpacking. And I started getting much more interested in Judaism as a college student and shortly after that. And then I was always looking for, is there some kind of Jewish environmental organization? Because it just sort of seemed to me that any tradition that had existed for thousands of years would have had to have some concept of sustainability, like how does it sustain itself on the land? So I started just this my own personal quest of reading everything I could. And I started studying one-on-one with a man named Ruvain Goldfarb in Berkeley. And we would study the portion of the week. So we were, and you started Genesis 1. And so we dove in, and I couldn't believe how much ecological depth there was just in Genesis 1. I think it took us like 2 months to get through just the first chapter. So that's kind of the whole background. And then with all of that kind of juice, I started looking more and more for a Jewish environmental organization. There wasn't anything. I looked for like 5 years. I ended up moving to Philadelphia. It's a whole other story, but when I moved there, I would ask everyone I knew, is there a Jewish environmental organization? And everyone would say, no, and you have to start one. So that's basically what happened. I had no organization. So this is also my blessing to you, Rebecca, because I had no organizational background. I didn't know much about Judaism. I just was passionate that all religions needed to take, the whole ecological crisis and do something about it. And I felt like that I just believed that the theology would be very consistent between Judaism and ecological ideas, in large part because ecology is all about consequences and interdependencies. And there's so much in Judaism that's all about what we do and the consequences of what we do. So it just seemed like a perfect match.
Well, you touched there briefly about studying with the rabbi in Berkeley and doing the Parsha and starting with Genesis, because you were, I guess, starting at the beginning. What were some of the things that you discovered in Genesis that you hadn't been hearing in your childhood Judaism or in other, even in other faith traditions?
Sure. Well, first of all, I should also mention this one other piece that's really important about my background is before I started studying, I had been teaching high school biology, and my students were not really interested in learning the science. I was using the traditional textbooks that I was given to teach, and they weren't responding to the science. And then I decided to try to write a curriculum using all the great nature writing that I had encountered myself and that had really sustained me in my youthful journey. And like people like Annie Dillard and Lauren Isley. And I created this whole curriculum of nature writers, and my students loved it. So I just wanted to, so then at that same time, I was interested spiritually. So it was it made sense that I would go from nature literature to biblical literature and just try understanding the literary dimensions. So again, to begin with Genesis 1, and just so that I really read text as a universalist and pretty mythically. And so there are several concepts in Genesis 1 that I had learned in ecological studies programs. So
can I pause you just for a second?
Sure.
So there's two creation stories in the Torah. So right. Genesis 1 is the seven day one, right? It's the first one we encounter.
Yep.
Correct. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you. And we can delve more into that and the difference between the two if you want, because most Jewish environmentalists are behind Genesis 2 and they don't like Genesis 1. But so Genesis 1 is, yes, the 7 days, and on each day, a different aspect of creation is created. And so just therein, I was excited. And the fact that like the habitats, right, water, air, and earth are the first three things that are created. And that was exciting to me, this appreciation for habitats, right? I mean, we have to think about what is in the Bible and what's not in the Bible. And just the fact that the habitats were the first thing that were created. And then out of them, all the inhabitants arose. And that at the end of each day of creation, God saw that it was good. And Maimonides, a great Jewish philosopher from the medieval period, talks about how this word tov, or good, means to have integrity. And so the notion is that everything that was created it's purposeful, it's there for a reason, it has value. And that's like the first principle of any environmental ethic, is to approach all of life with the understanding that it matters. We have to, clearly we can't save every living thing, but just being thoughtful about how we treat the earth. There's this other notion on the sixth day of creation is the day that humanity is created. And at the end of that day, animals are created and humans are created. And at the end of that day, it says, and God saw everything that God had created, and behold, it was very good. So the highest level of goodness is applied on the sixth day. And the way that's been read in modern times is that it's humanity that's considered very good. But it says specifically in the line, and God saw everything, the entire creation and all of the interdependence of all the creatures, that's what's very good. And I think, we've really lost that understanding in our culture. So those are, I could go on, but those are two of the things. Let me just say quickly one other piece, right? We get Shabbat, the seventh day. And, Shabbat is a remembrance of creation. So that every time that we're celebrating and honoring Shabbat, if, in my estimation, the way to be honoring Shabbat is to be honoring the entire creation.
That's beautiful. That's really beautiful. The other thing that I hadn't known until I listened to one of your talks at the Chautauqua Institute was even the way that God is described in Genesis 1. Like, you really picked up on something. I mean, in the Bible, there's so many different ways to think about God. And there's this very specific way in Genesis 1, which is...
Right. So, I mean, the way God is first presented to us is as Ruach Elohim, the spirit or the wind or the air of God. Ruach means wind or air. And these days, as you said, Rebecca, there are many different names for God. But this name for me at this time in history, to be thinking about God in terms of air, and just the connection to climate and weather just feels incredibly profound. So yeah, that has always stayed with me.
It's really, really powerful, as well as that way of thinking about Shabbat, not just about it being time, but also being this remembrance of all creation. And as I said in my introduction, you have published on this extensively in both the popular media and in some scholarly journals. And that's certainly one way that you've been communicating sort of this new interpretation of an eco-theology, of linking ecology and religion. But that's not all you've been doing, is the writing. Can we talk about some of the other ways that you've been reaching out?
Sure. Well, the very first thing I did with Shomrei Adamah was, and I think you mentioned it in the intro, was to develop Tu B'Shvat, the Jewish New Year of the Trees, as a Jewish Earth Day, an ecological kind of a festival. And I'll just talk a little bit about it. If you want to go into that more in depth, we can. But Tu B'Shvat was originally just a day to pay taxes on the fruit trees. And then the Kabbalists developed it more into this mystical holiday in the 1600s in Sfat. And I'm not going to go into all of their mystical aspects, but what I did was I used the basis of their Kabbalistic Tu B'Shvat Seder, and I framed it ecologically. So their Seder, the Kabbalistic Seder was based on 4 kind of psychological aspects, and which were like the world of doing, the world of feeling, the world of thinking, and the world of spirit. And those 4 dimensions translate perfectly into earth, water, air, and fire. And so I created a whole ecological Seder based on the 4 elements. And with music and readings and art, and just making it a big event that was accessible across broad audiences. So we held my first Seder in one of the boathouses in Philadelphia, and 200 people came, and I had brought together these artists and musicians that were known people in the Philadelphia community to actually write their own music for each element. And actually, this Seder was on National Public Radio. They did a 6-minute piece on it. And so that was it was very moving and exciting to be able to convey that work to convey these ideas, these ecological ideas in an artistic way, because I feel like that's what really is able to reach people. Like sometimes just giving people moral messages or telling them what to do or what you think is best. I think that kind of messaging can backfire, and people often have reactions. And for me, being able to convey these ideas through art, different, all different dimensions of art, is a way to speak to broad audiences of people.
And it seems as though using art, using music, this is connecting again to sort of this mythic understanding of our sacred texts. And, one thing that we've also talked about is the fact that when you had that first Tu B'Shvat Seder, which sounds completely amazing, I know that part of Philadelphia, and I can kind of imagine that. But this wasn't for a Jewish only audience, right? I mean, you've been connecting across different faith traditions for decades, right? And
yeah,
I mean,
so also I just want to say, right, I'm really interested in religion in the public domain, to be able to reach really broad audiences. So one of the beauties of that Seder was that I it was co-sponsored by the Philadelphia Parks Department. So that really contextualized this Seder and Judaism in the marketplace of ideas generally, which is, that's where I would like my work to sit, because I feel like a lot of, tons of Jews don't go to synagogue or don't identify with Jewish institutions. I mean, it's almost like a lot of these Jewish institutions are relics of the past and aren't really necessarily speaking to a contemporary audience. And also, like, to do work in the public sphere, I feel like gives Judaism a good name. I mean, it lets people see just all these other dimensions of Judaism that people have no idea about. So that feels really important to me.
It does seem very, very important. And it's a buzzword now. I mean, intersectionality, but what you're really talking about is bringing in different things and incorporating them and bringing people together in this more universal message is what I'm hearing you saying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it feels to me that what we've been talking about, your background, your sense of wonder in nature and place, your scholarship in the Bible, and with rabbinic interpretations of it, this communication, this broadening, this looking for a non-moral message has really culminated in your latest book, which is The Promise of the Land. And in this new Haggadah, which is the guidebook that we use for the Passover Seder, you're really charting new terrain here as well. This Haggadah has been called the first comprehensive ecological Haggadah. And I have a copy here, and we'll show you some pages in a minute. It's really just incredible. So I'm wondering if you could just tell us basically what makes the Promise of the Land unique, like in your view, what makes this Haggadah something special and different?
Okay, so, well, first of all, let me say that I was approached to write this Haggadah. So the publisher, Berman House, came to me about 5 years ago now to ask me if I could write a Passover Haggadah from an ecological perspective. And I wasn't 100% sure that I could, actually, because for me, I didn't want to just kind of greenwash a Passover Seder and just say, oh, isn't this cool? Let's add this to the Seder plate, or, let's talk about the plagues environmentally, which I could do. But for me, given my background, I only wanted to write a Passover Haggadah from an ecological perspective if I could kind of go into the depth of the tradition and see if there was anything actually ecological there. Because as we all know, right, what do we think about when we think of Passover? We think of the Jews are being liberated from Egypt by God, right? So what's ecological about that? So I ended up doing a lot of research and just meditating on things that I had already learned. And I realized that, well, first of all, anyone who has studied ecology in colleges is going to have studied the work of Aldo Leopold and probably Wendell Berry. And these people really, Aldo Leopold developed I'm sure a lot of people in your audience know as Midwesterners, that he developed what was called a land ethic. And he really understood ecology in terms of land. He understood the land as a living, breathing entity, and that land is similar to the way that we understand ecology. So that land is the soil and water and insects and animals and plants and us, everything all together is how he understood land. And he said that we needed to expand our sense of ethics beyond just a human community to the land as well. And he was writing in the 40s, the 1940s. So I just wanted to say that was part of like what's going on in my head all the time is thinking about land. So when Berman House asked me, I started wondering also, was there anything about, clearly the words ecology and environment and climate are not going to be part of Torah, but I wondered how else Torah might be talking about ecological ideas. And I started thinking about, well, maybe in terms of land, maybe I should check that out. And I actually did a teaching at your brother-in-law's synagogue in Amherst, just going through the 5 books of the Torah and looking at all of the places where the word eretz, which means both land and earth, all the places that it occurs. And actually the word eretz occurs over 2,000 times in the Bible. And then there's another word for land, which is adamah, and that occurs about 200 times. But 2,000 times is a lot of times in the Bible. And it was like, I started realizing that there were all of these sayings in Torah that we are all familiar with. Those of us who have studied a little bit or go to shul even a little bit, things like the phrase like justice, justice, you shall pursue, right? That should be familiar to a lot of people. But there's another piece of that line that says, so that you may live long on the land, or you may live long on this earth, because eretz means both land and earth. Honor your mother and your father and mother so that you may live long on the earth. So over and over in Deuteronomy, there are all of these laws, basically, that we're supposed to be doing so that we can live long on the land, the earth. Now, again, we can read eretz as a particular place, but we can also read it as the earth. It's both. It has the meaning of both. And for me, the way that I think about this as a person reading universally, I think about the land as the land in which I live in and am in reciprocal relationship with. So that's the background, okay, to the question that you're asking. So what I discovered, I went back to the original sources about what we're supposed to do when we celebrate Passover. I went back to the Talmud to look at that. And basically it says there's just a few things you're supposed to do. You know, in Judaism, every generation adds new texts to our rituals. But in the beginning, you know, you could have done your Passover Seder in a half an hour and been legitimate, basically. So you're supposed to drink 4 cups of wine, say some blessings and psalms, and you're supposed to talk about Pesach, matzah, and maror, the bitter herbs, and you're supposed to read one passage from the Bible, and that's the key for me. So, Julie, can you put that passage up? And if we can just see the top 4 verses first. So those of you who are very familiar with the conservative Haggadah, okay, great. The verses are, my father was a wandering Aramaean. He went down to Egypt with few numbers and sojourned there and became a great nation. The Egyptians dealt harshly with us and oppressed us, and they imposed hard labor on us. We cried out to God, the God of our ancestors. God heard our plea, saw our plight, our misery and oppression. And then God took us out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, awesome powers and signs and wonders. So these first 4 verses here are the verses that are traditionally in a conservative or Orthodox Haggadah. Sometimes, and they may be in a Reform Haggadah as well, but they were all mushed up inside of a midrash or a legend. And it's not really, a lot of people don't even know that this whole section is there. And so this may or may not be familiar to you. But what I realized after going back to this was that the rabbinic text says that it says we're supposed to read this passage that begins with the words, "My father was a wandering Aramaean," and we're supposed to read the entire passage, okay? So I went back and looked at this passage and realized that in fact, the Haggadot that most people read do not have the entire passage. There are 2 extra lines that got chopped off and never included in Haggadot starting 1,500 years ago. So those 2 lines that got dropped were, God brought us to this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. And now I bring the first fruits of the soil, which you, God, have given me. And the way I understand these 2 lines is so the question is, why did God free us to begin with, right? I mean, God just took us out. We were wandering and we were miserable and we cried to God and God took us out. But this answered the question to me, well, why did God bring us out? God brought us to bring us to a place, to a land, and it's our job to bring back the first fruits that come out of this land, our first harvest, back to God. And the way that I understand this is that there's this reciprocal relationship going on between the land and God and us. And we're in constant reciprocity that we need to be giving back to either literally giving back, and some people talk about this in terms of their compost, or how are they giving the fruits of their own labor out to the world, but that this perpetuates our ability to stay in the land, to stay on this earth. So I know that can be a little complicated, but that's what led me to think, oh, there's a dimension of land in the Haggadah that I never knew about. And once I felt confident that the original holiday was connected to a land, that meant that it was connected ecologically for me. Then I had the confidence and just felt that it was the right thing to do to write a Haggadah. Then the rest of it kind of fell in place. Each step along the way, I could make a connection. So each step along the way, I wanted to point out an ecological connection to every step of the Seder.
There's so much in what you just said there. I feel like we could talk for a week about that. One thing for me, as someone who chose to live in Montana, my husband and I moved out here. I think the story might be familiar to many people. We moved out here without jobs, and we fell in love with this place. And living in Montana, sometimes we take what they call a wilderness tax, jobs with less pay, because we feel so connected to this land, to this place. And hearing some of your past talks and looking at your reading, it's this idea of hamakom, of place. And then to think that that's connected in the story of of Passover, because if you could just talk briefly about, I was fascinated with your thoughts on, once the Jews are out of Egypt, they're wandering for 40 years in a place, right? And it is this place that has an impact on them and leads them. So, and then if you could just it's connected a little more to that idea of place, I guess is what I'm getting at.
Let's see. Can you try the question again?
I was rambling a little bit in my head, just sort of trying to connect, the idea of place to the Seder, which I think you've actually already done a really great job doing.
Well, I think one of the things that you mentioned that maybe is important to say is that we haven't touched on yet is that a rabbinic name for God is hamakom.
Yeah.
Right? So that's the rabbis would talk about God as hamakom, the place. And that's radical, a radical idea, because it's the place, it's the connections of all of the people and the places, and just to think about God in terms of place feels really profound to me. And I think, like, I used to give a talk on just thinking about God as a sense of place, before we talked about God in terms of Ruach Elohim. But here, thinking about God in terms of a sense of place and the feelings that we have by being connected to a place. And I to me, that's the sort of the upshot of that passage is that God gives us this place, and we must bring back our fruits back to God and to that place. It's sort of this, again, it's this reciprocal relationship. It's like the land takes care of us, and we need to take care of the land back, because the land is always taking care of us, right? And that's what you're feeling, right? You feel called to a place. I mean, I go through this all the time in my life. I've moved back and forth. I go from living in the country to moving into cities where it's like, sometimes if I feel like I really need community, I've left the country. But now that I'm in the city again, all I want is to be back in the country. So it's interesting. But it's, I want to say that not all people feel that, and it's great to have that sensibility. I think it enriches our lives to feel also, I think it really enriches our lives to feel that we have this connection to place, and it's that place is taking care of us, I mean, especially again, in these times that are so fraught, to be able to have our gardens and the woods that we love and the mountains that we love and the streams, and to be able to have a place to go where we feel held.
Thank you for reading my mind there. It was exactly that idea about God as hamakom, God as place, that just was so radical to me. It kind of took my breath away. So thank you for getting underneath my garbledness. Another thing that's amazing about this Haggadah, in my opinion, and I don't know if Julie, you could show like another one of the pages. Let's talk about the art in this book. Can you? I mean, it's just a gorgeous book. Can you talk to us a little bit about why that was important to you and what role it plays in this book?
Sure. So I'll start. Yeah. So yes, the art for me is really important in the Haggadah, and I I feel like an aesthetic approach to ecological problems, environmental problems, climate problems, is often very overlooked. And what I mean by that is that, when you think of the word anesthesia, it's anesthesia. You take an anesthetic when you don't want to feel, right? When you go to the dentist's office, you don't want to feel anything. But aesthetics is about what is it that makes you feel. And so for me, this whole concept of beauty and having art and something beautiful to uplift the Haggadah is incredibly important, because it reaches, again, we mentioned this a little bit before, reaching across the ideological divides. I feel like, that half of the problem with our climate crisis is that we have vast language divides, ideological divides, generational divides, and I think that that environmental communication has taught us, the field of environmental communication, that most people, the way they make decisions has to do with their feelings. and has to do with either their feelings or what their friends are thinking. And so the idea of having this art, each step of the Seder has a piece of art that goes along with it. And the idea is hopefully that people will be able to really sink in to each page and have a feeling of it, rather than, as is the case in so many Seders, that people are just rushing to finish the Seder, right? And get to the food, right? So this is the feast along the way, is the art, and to feast your eyes and to feast your heart as we're going through the Haggadah.
I love thinking about it as that's the feast is along the journey. And the other thing I just wanted to note for folks is, I mean, this is a traditional Seder text, and it's also a very unique text, and it's really simple to use in the way that you have text in different colors and you have commentary broken out on the sides. It's just very visually welcoming. I mean, and very striking. So it's just very exciting that that's out there. I wanted to just pause for a second and encourage folks, if you have questions, to type them into the chat. It looks like maybe we'll see, have some time for some questions from Ellen. So I guess moving on from the Haggadah, which that was published 2 years ago.
Yeah, last year, beginning of the pandemic.
Okay. Oh, perfect timing to launch a book. What are you working on currently?
So as I've mentioned early on, like, I'm really interested in the Bible generally, and reading the Bible from an ecological perspective. And for me, and one of the reasons that I'm so interested in Bible itself is because it reaches not just Jews, but also Christians, and people who are interested in spiritual literature. And so I've been in my readings of the Bible, I came to realize that the Song of Songs is this profoundly ecological text that most people are very unaware of. I mean, people are very aware of the Song of Songs, aware of its,
I've just got on, but I'm not impressed.
Whoops, someone else is speaking there, but so people are interested in the Song of Songs for its romantic, it's seeming to be about secular love. And then, other people are interested in it for other reasons. The language is beautiful, poetry is beautiful, but I found it to be this profoundly ecological text. And so I've just finished a book, and hopefully it will find a home and get published before too long. So that's one project, and I have another,
congratulations.
Thank you. And I have another book that I'm working on that really takes some of these ideas that I've been talking about in Genesis 1. Again, we didn't really go into Genesis 1 versus Genesis 2, but I'm really interested in Genesis 1 and how the ideas have sort of gone underground after the creation stories, but then they pop up throughout the 5 books in different places, and just trying to show how these ideas, even though we don't see them kind of on the surface of the rest of Torah, that they are there if you just dig a little bit. And then I'm involved in the Green Sabbath Project, and I'm working with the Third Act, which is Bill McKibben, the environmentalist, who started 350. He started the Third Act, which is for people that are over 60, working on environmental stuff. And I'm on the steering committee for Third Act Faith. So it's people of different faiths coming together and working on different environmental projects.
That sounds like a lot.
Yeah.
Keeps you busy. Earlier on, we talked a little bit about your more universal message and trying to get beyond this very kind of moral language that both religion and the environmental movement can use. And it just made me wonder about, challenges that you face as you do this work. If you had any thoughts on that.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, there's tons of challenges. And it's interesting because on the one hand, there is a lot more attention being given to environmental climate problems today than there ever was in the past. As I think I mentioned, when I graduated college, there was one job you could have with an environmental studies major, and it was doing environmental impact statements. That was it. And so one of the problems, it seems, is that everybody wants to talk about green this or green that or climate this or climate that. And I think that what happens is, I think that certain people are completely turned off by sort of the environmentalism language and climate justice language. And it's like a trigger language for some people who are more conservative and they may be interested in the future of our planet and in energy and in alternatives. But I mean, there's been plenty of studies on this, right? That when people who don't define themselves as liberals necessarily may feel put off by language that sounds moralizing to them, like, that some, Northeast person is coming into rural wherever or into the South and telling them what to do. And to me, this is really a problem of language and language and ideas. And a lot of these people, a lot of conservatives may be really interested in, if you talk to them about land, or if you talk to them about their waters, or you talk about the air, you talk about energy. But climate, the word climate and environmentalism have been associated with, they've become politicized. And so it just seems like whenever you use those words, then you're inviting just that audience, right? And then the audience of people who are uncomfortable with that language, they tune right out. And to me, the reaching across the ideological divide feels like as much a part of the solution as any climate solution. I mean, I just feel like this is like the most important thing. And as a religious person or spiritual person, it feels particularly important for us to be paying close attention to the language that we're using and who we're alienating and who we're inviting with our language. And again, that's why the art is so important to me, and celebration and just doing things are going to be an invitation to everybody to come together, I just want to say, like, one of my favorite parts of Torah is the building of the Mishkan. When everybody comes to build the Mishkan, everyone comes together and they give all their money and, all their goods to build this Mishkan. It's the only time in the Torah where the Israelites aren't complaining and everybody's getting along, when they have a building project together, And that's what that's what my dream would be, is that people could come together to rebuild this world together, and to engage in projects together.
You kind of answered my last question, I think, with that, but maybe you wanted to say a little bit more. Living here in Montana, I think living anywhere in the United States, but I mean, here in Montana, our world is literally on fire more and more every summer, and spring sometimes. I'm just wondering, I mean, I love this idea of coming together and building. Is that how you think that your ideas and your work and this sort of mindset can help us as individuals and communities, moving forward in this time of anxiety and fear? And
well, I feel like religious communities have a particular role to play. I mean, I always felt like they had a particular role to play around being leaders, right, in environmental repair. Okay, religious communities have not stood up to this challenge. But I'm thinking, like, if they don't stand up to the challenge of climate anxiety, they're just going to continue to lose people. Like, one of the beauties of religious community is community, right? And people suffering all over the world from not having community. I mean, at the very least, religious leaders need to understand what's happening with youth that are growing up with all of this anxiety, grief, not knowing about their future, uncertainty, fear. This is something that they would potentially go to rabbis for counsel around, and their communities to hold them during, I mean, this is heavy stuff. And so, again, it's my prayer that religious institutions will start to grow more in that direction. Otherwise, what's going to happen is people will create their own, right, small communities and stuff, but we'll just be losing more and more from established Jewish and Christian institutions.
Yeah. Well, I second your prayer that we can come together and that we can build something together across these boundaries and these divides. We're nearly out of time. I didn't know, Julie, was there a question that we wanted to read? Did anyone have a question?
I don't see any questions in the chat, but we do have some time for one or two. If folks have any questions for Rabbi Bernstein, feel free to drop them in the chat.
Or just to ask them.
Or just ask.
Yeah. Well, while you think of that, I'm just going to tell you that if you're interested, we'll be sending out a follow-up email with how you can learn more about Ellen and her work with a link to her website. There's some really amazing content on there and ways that you can, and she just put the link in the chat there. Thank you very much. That's the link to the book, the Haggadah. And as I said, I mean, I really feel like we could have Ellen come and talk every day for a month, and we would just be scratching the surface. We could have spent a whole couple hours just talking about the two creation stories, and so it's kind of painful not to have more time. So I'm just gonna close. Thank you so much, Ellen. Thank you, Rabbi Bernstein, for joining us and for being our first speaker. I also want to thank everyone for coming out today. I know it's a beautiful day, a day when we'd like to be out appreciating our place, and for you to be on Zoom is really, really wonderful. So please check out our website. I think Julie might have a slide for that, or if that's in the chat as well, for future events, including an interesting interfaith panel next weekend, which will touch on a different angle of some of the things that Ellen was talking about, and for ways that you can get involved if you want us to keep putting out programs and bringing in speakers like this and doing the work that we're doing. We're so very grateful for everyone for coming. Have a wonderful rest of your evening. And thank you again, Ellen. It's been really wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks for all that you are doing. I really appreciate it.
Yes. Take care. Happy Passover.
Happy Passover.
Bye.